Welcome to another edition of Head On Shaw TV. I'm Ian Holmes, your host. The Strait of Georgia, the coast Salish Sea, it's a big part of many of our lives, socially, culturally, economically, but a lot of us see the ocean, don't really know what's going on in there. It's a very mysterious animal that is the Strait of Georgia, and science, climate change, these factors, human interaction is having a massive impact on the Strait of Georgia and the living organisms in the ocean. And moving ahead, that's where science comes in to find out a little bit more about how to best manage these very important ecosystems that is in the Strait of Georgia. And over the past 5 years, there's been a study going on. DFO scientists at the Pacific Biological Station in Nanaimo, co-headed by Dr. Ian Perry, my guest here today, delved into the Strait of Georgia and a research study looking at the various organisms and how they all interact with each other. Ian, thanks for coming on. This is going to be a very fascinating discussion. I really appreciate you coming on.
My pleasure, Ian.
So this is a very massive study, 50 scientists, and just explain a little bit about why this study is so important to carry on in.
Sure. Well, you're probably aware that around the world, fish stocks and marine ecosystems have been in trouble. There have been many problems. Some of them are quite degraded, although some of them are doing not too badly. Many reasons for this, one of which is that we tend traditionally and in the past to have managed fisheries on a single stock basis. So for example, we take herring. It's an important species here in the Strait of Georgia. We would manage herring just looking at the herring population dynamics, not being concerned about which species feed on herring, the role that herring plays in other species. But of course, other species do feed on herring. We need to take into account how the herring interact with these other species, how much herring is there for these other species to feed. We need to also look at the habitat that herring live in. So all of those are involved in what we call an ecosystem approach to understanding in our case, the Strait of Georgia, and to an ecosystem approach to managing the Strait of Georgia system. Canada, about 10 years ago, committed to adopting or evolving away from the single species approach towards an ecosystem approach to managing marine resources. The problem is that that's really hard to do. It's been hard to do for single species, and when we talk about how these species all interact in the ocean, it becomes even more difficult. So we've developed a pilot project to try and understand some of the science issues involved in moving towards an ecosystem approach to managing the Strait of Georgia. And on the West Coast, the Strait of Georgia is the system that we have chosen.
Now, in your research has uncovered a lot of changes in the Strait of Georgia. Let's talk a little bit about that and the impact that these shifts have in the Strait. This is some pretty fascinating stuff.
Sure, you bet. The Strait of Georgia, of course, any ecosystem is changing, and some of the real question is what's causing those changes. Are those changes being caused by the environment, by climate, in which case we can't really do much about it, or are the changes being driven by something that we do, fishing, coastal development, all these sorts of things. I might add that the Strait of Georgia is the body of water that goes between Vancouver and Vancouver Island. In our study, we included the Strait of Georgia, the Strait of Juan de Fuca, which is south of Victoria, and some also looked at the Puget Sound. All of those are part of what's now called the Salish Sea. So the Salish Sea is a name for the whole area, and Strait of Georgia is still the name for that body of water in between the Vancouver Island and the mainland. And we've seen things or found that things like the temperature has been warming. So we've seen a rise of 1, almost 2 degrees increase in average temperature over the last 100 years. We've seen things like, and you'll be familiar with this, changes in salmon populations. Some salmon populations are doing poorly, and some salmon populations are actually doing quite well. Along with that, we've seen changes in the commercial fisheries. So we have stopped, or at least there's not many commercial fisheries for the big bottom fish like halibut and cod anymore. And we've seen changes in seals. When I talk to the general public, to fishing industry people and organizations, everybody wants to know about seals. And so we've seen the seal population has been increasing exponentially up until about the year 2000. And then it's flattened out. And it's flattened out about 40,000 seals in the Strait of Georgia. It turns out that there's about as many seals now as there were in the 1880s. What we think may be happening is that seals are just reestablishing their natural abundance in the Strait of Georgia ecosystem. Interestingly, along with the increase in seals, we've seen an increase in the sightings of transient killer whales. Now, you may know there are 3 different kinds of killer whales on the coast. The residents, here most of the time, transients, which tend to eat marine mammals, and then a group offshore, which don't come into the Strait of Georgia. So as the numbers of seals have increased in the Strait of Georgia, so too have the abundances of these transient killer whales. And they may also be a reason that the seal population has leveled off over the last 10 years. The whales eating the seals.
Very interesting. You touched on the ocean temperature rising. This is part of climate change. It goes warmer and colder, but you're mentioning that the trend now, it's starting to really spike up 1 to 2 degrees over per 100 years. This could have a seemingly a pretty big impact on what lives in the ocean. And you're saying that there could be some winners and losers that adapt to the warming ocean temperatures. So what's our ecosystem going to look like as our ocean heats up?
Yeah, that's a great question. You're right. The temperature doesn't just go up in a linear or a straight line fashion. It wobbles and wiggles around. In the 1960s, temperatures were much colder than they are now. In the 1990s, they're much warmer. In fact, we had some of our highest temperatures in the 1990s. We were cold again around 2000, and then warm about 2005, and the last 5 years have actually been cool. But on average, the trend has been increasing. So we've seen higher highs and higher low temperatures, meaning that the temperature, as I say, on average has been going up. And we expect that will continue. The wiggles and the wobbles will continue. It's the same thing. You know that this spring we've got some nice weather. Last 2 springs, actually, we had very cold temperatures. So the same thing happens in the ocean. Some years will be warmer, some years will be cooler. But on average, things will get warmer. By 2050, we've done some modeling studies which have projected what these changes may mean for the ecosystem and the animals that live in the Strait of Georgia over the next 40 years. Now, the first thing I have to tell you is that these are done using computer models. The second thing is that all of these models are wrong. It's just some are more wrong than others. So we use them as not to make, how shall I say, firm management decisions, but we use them to play different scenarios. We use them like a laboratory. We say, if the world works like this, and if these changes happen like this, what might be the consequences? And what that does, it allows us to say, well, if we manage things differently, if we backed off from harvesting this species, or maybe harvested that species a little bit more, what might be the results? And so we can kind of plan out or play out different scenarios in a warming climate.
And under that scenario of a warming climate, which seems to be the trajectory right now, what species will flourish and what ones will suffer?
Yeah, so given that all models are wrong to some extent.
Under your models,
yeah,
of course.
Right, exactly. It's interesting that the marine mammals seem to be quite resilient to future changes, at least up to over the next 40 to 50 years. They're at the top of the food web. They tend to be able to eat a number of things that they can catch underneath them in the food web. The one exception might be the resident orcas, the resident killer whales, which seem to have a particular, what would be the word, a particular focus on Chinook salmon. So as Chinook salmon go, so too may the resident killer whales. Amongst the large fish, things like lingcod and halibut, some years they will do very well. Other years, they don't do very well at all. And the real problem comes when we have a run of poor years, which would mean that some of those populations may, in fact, collapse. The one population, or the one species that may have trouble, interestingly, are crabs. And that's not so much because of temperature, but because something that goes along with the warmer temperatures, and that's a more acid ocean. We call it ocean acidification.
Interesting. Salmon is a huge issue for more so I'd say the sport fishermen around mid-Vancouver Island, but there's a commercial fishery element in there as well, especially with the Fraser River salmon fishery. So what's your opinion on salmon populations? How are they going to handle the heat, so to speak, when the ocean starts to warm up a little bit here, Ian, did your research reveal how salmon are going to handle this change?
We indeed, yes. Salmon, of course, are iconic species for the West Coast here. They had to be part of our study, and they were. We had a number of studies looking at them. And in fact, salmon have been a big issue for the Department of Fisheries and Oceans over several years. We've seen, as I mentioned, some salmon species do very well. Pink salmon, for example, have been doing very well recently. Other species like sockeye, of course, have been declining over the 1990s. Chinook salmon, the big king salmon, have declined as well. Sockeye salmon have been going down. The key with salmon is that there's 5 different species, and even within a species, there's a number of different lifestyles. Some tend to spend a year in the freshwater, some go to the ocean right away. So the key there is to maintain the genetic diversity of these salmon populations. Because a species like Chinook, it occurs all the way down to California. Most of the species, something like sockeye, maybe pink salmon, they tend to be more abundant up towards Alaska. So they're really a cold water species. But Chinook can handle some fairly warm temperatures. So what we expect is that with the warming, some of the populations will probably decline, but others, because they're genetically adapted to warmer temperatures, will do quite well. So I expect we'll still have salmon. We may have fewer salmon and maybe fewer species than we do at the moment, but I'm pretty sure that we'll still have salmon at least over the next 50 years. After we go out 100 years, 150, well, that's a completely different ballgame. And our models are completely wrong at timescales like that.
So you have your 5 years of research all wrapped up. Your 50 scientists put in thousands of hours of work. What do you do with all this information to make this, instead of gathering on a shelf somewhere, gathering dust, how to make this actually effective and implement some of these measures to ensure that the Georgia Strait ecosystem is going to flourish for many years to come?
Yeah, I love your comment about gathering dust on shelves, because that's what happens to a lot of recommendations and indeed some research in some cases. What we're doing is we're wrapping up the study at the moment, and then we're moving these up through Fisheries and Oceans to be able to turn the scientific knowledge, the understanding that we've gained about how this system works and what is driving changes, into making better management advice. And there are at least 3 or 4 items in particular that we want to emphasize. One is to understand how the system works, which we've been doing, and in particular what's causing changes, whether the changes are due to environmental conditions or whether they're due to fishing, or more likely a combination of both. The human population around the Strait of Georgia is increasing at a very rapid rate. That's having other effects in addition to fishing on the Strait of Georgia. The second thing that we're trying to develop, or are developing, are indicators of ecosystem status. That tells us, if you like, about a quick measure of the health of the ecosystem, similar to pulse as for your body health. The third one would be monitoring, where to monitor in the Strait of Georgia. And then the fourth one is more details, understanding where are the special places in the Strait of Georgia. Which are the places that need to be protected because they don't occur anywhere else, because they have some special value or role in the whole way that the ecosystem of the Strait of Georgia functions.
And just quickly before we wrap up, just what are those special areas that have been identified?
Southern Some of them are, there are some sponge reefs in the Strait of Georgia, which are quite rare. We have areas around the southern Gulf Islands are very special. Fraser River plume, of course. Areas off of Bain Sound and Denman Island are an area of special area for many species, and also has got a lot of management issues there associated with different habitat changes and such.
Thanks so much, Dr. Ian Perry. Thanks for coming on the program, and a real eye-opener on the many changes that are going on below the ocean. We don't think too much about that, but there's a lot going on there, and thanks for, in a condensed version, of breaking this all down for us. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Dr. Ian Perry, research scientist with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans at the Biological Station here in Nanaimo, offering a very in-depth view of the changes going on in the Strait of Georgia with this study now wrapping up, a 5-year study of the Strait of Georgia's ecosystem. That's it for another edition of Head On. I'm Ian Holmes. Tune in next time. We'll delve into the issues that really matter on Mid-Vancouver Island. Thanks for tuning in.